So let's get started. Let's shut her down. Always kill the power first and make sure we always unplug, of course. Time to swap out the nice wristwear for the nerd wristwear. Also to note that these M2 SSDs are not in here properly. Fine, they're probably working, but the spacer's missing on both of these, and they're at an angle which could break the pins over here, the blade connector. Don't know how it didn't break already, but we'll make sure we put these on properly on the new motherboard. I love this chassis because it is so easy to get to the CPU power cables. Normally they're wedged up in that upper left hand corner. It's so hard. This was easy. Take off the water cooler. Good amount of thermal paste. It still looked good, but we're going to clean it off obviously anyway. Put new thermal paste on. And we're ready to take out this motherboard. As a courtesy, we're going to take some compressed air and just blow everything out that's remaining and give it a good wipe down now that everything's out and it's a little safer. So let's go do that. So if you can see in there, what it looks like is this isn't going to be sufficient. Sometimes when there's dust and humidity, the dust will get caked on the heatsink. So as the liquid is flowing from the processor heatsink through the tubes through this cooler, I like to refer to as a radiator on the back, these fins are totally clogged. This is going to need to totally come out and be cleaned thoroughly because this CPU can't possibly be cooling properly, especially with this new i9 processor being put in. There definitely will be issues in cooling, so we're gonna have to take that apart. So here's a deeper look at what the caked on dust looks like, and this won't blow off, so we're gonna have to take all this apart and clean it a different way. To get off that back of it all-in-one pump radiator, we have to take off the back to get that off. Here's the back side. Here are the 4 screws to take off that radiator. And obviously the back looks nice and clean because the fins are pretty small. All that dust gets trapped, sucking the air in this way. It doesn't go through, so you see none of it went through. So we're going to clean it from this side out to get all that dust to go out the other side. I lied. There's actually 8 screws, 2 on the top, 2 on the bottom, and 4 in the middle. Okay, we're back outside. We're going to blow some air through this. Obviously that's not moving too much, so we're going to give it a little bit of help with a little brush. Look at that. You can see through it. Looking good. Next up, we're going to have to clean these fans. These might be a little quicker, a little easier. So we're going to disconnect them from the controller. Make sure we pay attention where they were plugged in to make life easier later, and clean those off. So we're outside again, and we're going to give these a little blow out. Are pretty time consuming to clean, so we brush these off for the most part. That little bit of dust that's left over will be absolutely fine. It'll still be running hundreds of times better than it was before. So we're gonna go with our alcohol wipes, super industrial pack, and clean some of this inside, make it look like new. Alright, we're ready to start working on the new motherboard. Processor time. Grounding strap back on. This is a very expensive processor. Critical step here. We can't have the processor zapped, because the voltage in our body is different than the voltage on the motherboard. Therefore, it would have an electronic static discharge when we pop it in. Make sure it's seated perfectly, which you can see these, you can't really mess them up. So we will push this down, and we can see the latch putting pressure down on the processor, and she's in. Double check our RAM to make sure that it's DDR4, same as last time. Older motherboards may have had DDR3, so these look like a good fit, so we'll pop these in. Now for electrostatic discharge, to prevent damage, we're going to now move the clip to the chassis, so when we secure and put the motherboard onto the chassis, there will be no voltage difference and no discharge. Before we do that, we're going to pop in the M2 drives. This one actually has the riser and it's flat. There's no angle on it, so we don't have the same problem as existed in the previous motherboard with these drives. The screw for the SSDs always comes with the motherboard. You can get those out of the individual bag that they come in. This customer had a secondary M2 drive, probably for storage, as well as a SATA drive here for storage as well, which is connected through one of these SATA connectors here. So we're going to take this cover off and see how the M2 drive fits in there. Holy moly, there are 3 additional M2 slots underneath this huge heatsink. Again, this one has the riser here, or spacer, whatever we want to call it. So when we snap in the drive, it will sit, so now it's nice and flat and it's not at an angle. So we can reinstall the covers now, the heatsink / cover. And one more step before we actually put this motherboard in, we have to get the plate off. We have to have the specific plate that'll mount to this socket processor. And now we install the bracket, putting it through the 4 holes on the motherboard, and then we'll screw in to these threaded holes. And now we're ready again to pop this in. We're going to make sure some of these cables have not fallen through so we can't get to them later. The audio cable would be a little tricky one. We have the power switch cables down here, USB header down here. Can't miss these. So we'll make sure that those are out and we should be ready to go. Pop it in. So before we put in the things that'll obstruct our view a little bit, like the GPU and all-in-one, before we connect to the processor, we're going to get all these connectors on, all the little wires that go everywhere, and then we're going to put on the bigger pieces. So this is where you have to be patient. You can't rush it and you can't make mistakes. Don't be afraid to open up the manual. A lot of the motherboards don't come with a manual. You need to go online. But for example, I would look here for the front audio panel, F audio. I see on the motherboard it's right down here, and you can see that there's a missing pin on the lower left, one from the left. I look at my audio cable and I look to see where I have that blank spot, which is in the lower left, so I need to turn it around and go in that way. That may or may not be the same direction it was on the other motherboard. The most annoying, in my opinion, is the front panel, so we can get to where all the switches are for the USB ports, the reset, the LED, the hard drive LED, all that kind of stuff. All those cables snake down, go to here, and as you can see, they're always individual because they need to fit different motherboards, different places. So all these need to find the right home here. So don't be afraid to use this die. Another thing we have to watch out for is what type of header is coming from the front. This one doesn't happen to have USB-C. It's just looks like USB 2.0 and 3.0, so we wouldn't be using this one. It wouldn't fit anyway. So we have USB, which is over here on the side for one of these. We also have another USB header over here, which is probably the one I'm going to use. We can look down here to see that pin configuration. One missing in the upper left. So we make this oriented where there's one missing now in the upper left, and we pop it in. Next up, easy ones, we get our SATA connectors to go into the SATA ports right here. Main power to the motherboard. Where when you're switching motherboards from an older one to a newer one, the newer one might require more power. So this old motherboard that was in here had the CPUs come in a bundle of 4 pins, 2 for ground, 2 for 12 volts. There was 1, 2, so that means it was a total of 8 pins. This one requires an extra 4-pin connector, so it's a total of 12 pins needed. So an extra cable is needed to go into the second CPU slot of the power supply. So if you're ever upgrading your motherboard, make sure you have another cable that you can use. We're putting in our GPU riser, I guess we can call it, or cable to make it adapt to be vertical. Next we'll pop in the GPU into the riser card, vertical adapter. Signal's been connected, now we connect our power to our GPU. You know, this thermal paste is good, it's messy, so we're gonna clean it off. Nice and clean. Too much thermal paste where it gets sloppy and everywhere, but you do have to make sure that when the heatsink is pressed down, that it's going to cover the entire surface area of the processor. And we have our all AIO pump. Some of the motherboards will say AIO pump, some will say CPU fan. Either way, that's how it works. Now we go back to put our Oh, wrong way. We have to put our all-in-one pump radiator. Not sure if that's the right term or not, but that's what it is. So we had the 8 screws on the back, so those 8 are in now. We mount our 2 fans to the radiator and snake the cables to the back to the color controller and fan controller. So before we put any covers back on, anything like that, we're going to plug in the power. We are going to plug in a USB dongle for a wireless mouse and keyboard, and we're going to plug in the display port that goes to our monitor. Pop on the power, which I just did. We're going to then hit the power button and see if everything's connected right. So far so good. GPU is lighting up, RAM is lighting up, fans are spinning for the all-in-one pump. We do have a red light, but we'll see if that goes away soon. We'll get to that in a moment. A new motherboard will take a few seconds to figure out what's going on. GPU fans will spin for a little while as like a power on self-test, and then they'll eventually stop spinning until they're needed. So we'll wait and see what happens. Just to correct myself a little bit, some processors have graphics processor capabilities built in, some do not. Either way, it was a smarter idea to plug in the display port into the GPU directly. So once we do that, we have our BIOS up and we see that we have our 16 gigabytes of RAM in each slot. So we have a nice, beautiful 64 gigabytes of RAM installed. We see our temperatures right here, the CPU temperature. On the system temperature, we have it down at 30 Celsius, which is great. We have our motherboard showing us that we have the 12th generation i9 processor, which is great. We have our CPU fan, which is now, our pump running, and it's pumping, so that's great. So everything looks good. So we're gonna go in and see if we could boot to these hard drives now, or the one that was designated already as the bootable device. So that was a half hour of troubleshooting, and I learned something new today. I didn't know that on this new motherboard that I haven't installed before, that there's a reason why there's not a reason, but there's 4 M2 slots. I didn't know they were different. So these 2 are reserved only to recognize M2. I think it's whatever it is, the 4th generation, the latest revision. The bottom 2 are for legacy. Maybe it says it on there somewhere. I didn't see it. So what we're gonna have to do now is, since these are older SSDs, we're gonna take these and we're gonna transfer them down to the lower slots and see if they recognize in the BIOS, because these were not visible in the BIOS at all. Well, what do you know? Windows 11 just started magically booting when drives were moved to the compatible slots. What a surprise. So we go into system settings, make sure everything recognizes. The system recognizes the i9 12th gen. It recognizes the 64 gigabytes of RAM. It also recognizes our only one drive. So we're gonna figure out why it's only seeing 1 terabyte drive. We'll figure out the other one. I'm sure it's in disk management, and we'll figure out that next. Probably have to load the drivers for the GPU, most likely. Let's take a quick glance. It sees it. We're still gonna do the driver updates anyway. We do have this RTX 2080 Super in here. It does show the 8 gigabytes of dedicated RAM, but we're gonna do all the updates anyway. Let's talk about a couple things real fast. So this motherboard has Wi-Fi built in, which I don't necessarily love. Comes with this cool nifty antenna, which kind of is weird on this case, but I think whatever, it's magnetic, it'll go right there. So we're gonna screw these wires in. But one thing that always bothered me a little bit about these motherboards with Wi-Fi built in, the drivers don't auto recognize. So, it'll download the drivers to make the Wi-Fi adapter seen, but you have to have internet to begin with. So it's kind of weird. There's an easy solution for it, which I don't know why these motherboard companies don't do it. It's really nice to do, and it's super cheap, so I don't know why they don't do it. I'll show you in a moment what I'm talking about. So here's what I'm talking about. I sell them for 10 bucks. It's a little Wi-Fi adapter. The nice thing is, though, that these Wi-Fi adapters, they're simple and they don't require any drivers. So it's 10 bucks. So with a company like Asus or MSI, I bet they can get those for like probably $1 from TP-Link. So notice that there's no drivers needed, and we're just gonna go and find my Wi-Fi real quick. And we connect to Wi-Fi. So now, magically, after we connect to Mr. Tech Guest, we'll get on the internet, and now it's gonna download all the drivers we need. But for certain people, a wired connection isn't possible. So this must be pretty miserable for people that want to build a gaming computer, and they have super strong Wi-Fi so they can game, but they just don't have an Ethernet cable, and they don't have obviously a wireless Ethernet adapter. I assume most people don't have these in their house. So I guess it's kind of annoying why these motherboard companies don't step it up a little bit and include what they can get for like $2 or $3 extra for the people that need it. And then the customer's left with a Wi-Fi adapter that they can use for other stuff if they need to over the years. That's it. Let's move on. So now we have the Asus app downloading. It's downloading the audio driver, the Wi-Fi driver, of course, the LAN driver for the Ethernet port, because you should be running this with an Ethernet port anyway, after everything I just said. And that's it. We're also going to do the Microsoft Windows updates as well, so we can't skip those. So we could run those in parallel, should be safe. So we'll go to updates and see what Microsoft has to offer.